Welcome to Battleship Cove Inside the History Series. Today we're on USS Massachusetts, or more affectionately named Big Mamie. We're going to discuss a little bit about the 16-inch 45 three-gun turrets. The 6-inch 45s on this fast attack battleship. As you can see behind us, turret 1 and turret 2. We're going to go inside turret 2. We're going to talk with gunner's mate Thomas Lowney, who was in number 1 gun as an active duty crew member on USS Wisconsin. The interesting thing about the 6-inch 45 battery is that the fast battleships of the North Carolina and South Dakota class both carried the Mark 6 gun. The Mark 6 gun is known in World War II for its history with the USS Washington in the Battle of Guadalcanal firing on the Japanese battleship Hiroshima, and also Battleship Massachusetts, Big Mamie, she fired on the Jean Bart with her Mark 6 6-inch 45 turret at the Battle of Casablanca in 1942. The 6-inch 45 also was well known as firing the first U.S. Navy 16-inch shell of World War II, and also the last 16-inch shell of World War II as well. So let's go check that out now. Welcome inside the main battery gun turret of USS Massachusetts. We're here with USS Wisconsin veteran from gun turret number 1. He was a 6-inch gunner's mate in the U.S. Navy. He's also grew up locally, and he's been a gunner's mate on USS Massachusetts since he was a little kid. Basically, he's been a volunteer here for a long time. Now Tom Lowney here has worked on the 6-inch 50 battery, as we talked about, on the USS Wisconsin, but he's going to explain a little bit about the 6-inch 45 gun system on the USS Massachusetts. And as we talked about, the 6-inch 45 gun system was very historical in World War II. The North Carolina and the South Dakota-class battleships carried the Mark 6 gun. Tom's going to talk a little bit about that. Like we talked about before, the first combat shell from a U.S. Navy ship in World War II was fired by a Big Mamie from one of these guns. And the last shell of World War II for 6-inch battery was fired by a Mark 6 as well. And as we discussed a little bit before briefly, the USS Washington with South Dakota herself at the Battle of Guadalcanal used their Mark 6 6-inch 45 batteries to put down the Japanese battleship Hiroshima. So Tom, can you explain to us a little bit about the 6-inch 45 main battery gun system on the Massachusetts?
Sure I can, Rich. Well, welcome aboard Massachusetts. We're standing here right now in the 16-inch 45 3-gun turret. These are common battery for the fast battleships. They're called fast battleships because they were generations ahead of the previous battleship designs and incorporated vast amounts of improvements, the turret being one of them. The turret actually has 3 separate operating guns. They do train separately, but they elevate separately to enable loading and firing of the guns separately, because in turret 2, during the Battle of Casablanca, the center gun of turret 2 is the center point of the ship. So for firing calculations and purposes, you would want to use that gun for your ranging, which means you're establishing your firing zones where you're going to be landing your rounds, and the center of the ship is the best point for it. So the center gun would be your highlight point, and that's why usually many battleships have their center gun and turret 2 replaced more often, because the barrel life is only 395 rounds fired per. So the turret we're standing in right now, this is the turret officer's booth. This is where the turret officer, the fire control technicians, and the chief of the turret would be up in here. They'd be directing the turret. They don't directly control it. They direct it. They can fire it. There's usually a firing trigger here when they were ready to fire. Now, this turret is set up with a rangefinder. The rangefinder right here was typical for the gun turrets, and it allowed the turret to act as its own director and local control. There are many forms of local control here. It can be done from the gun layer stations. It can be done from the sight setter stations on the left and right side of the gun, and the rangefinder here, stereoscopic rangefinder. Now, that was in case you had to go to local control. It was more efficient to use the gunfire directors and gun plot to control these turrets. They'd be put into a remote, but they can be fired locally. Some fascinating things with the 16-inch gun that can be done. And when we go in the gun, I'll point out a few things for you about the 16-inch guns.
So Tom, can you tell a little bit about the difference between a 6-inch 45 gun that we have on Big Mamie and the ones that you used on Iowa, the 6-inch 50?
The 16-inch 50s and the 45s are very similar in a lot of perspectives in general operations. It's like looking at a F-150 and 250 with a cab extension. It's just a step in the evolution of the 16-inch gun. The 16-inch 50 was a few feet longer in the barrel, which gave it a better accuracy, and it was able to fire a lot bigger charge, which was about 20 pounds more black powder, not black powder, nitrocellulite. Black powder is the ignition pad in it, but we'll cover that later. And that allowed for a better, accurate, longer range firing gun. The difference was about 2 miles. But for long distance shots, every little bit helps because you're talking yards. The standard accuracy for a 16-inch projectile, both for the 50 and the 45, was within a 3-yard radius. So when you're making a crater 20 feet deep, 30 feet wide, pretty close to on target, because you'd be taking everything out, or penetrating up to 30 inches of concrete. Because the same shells could be fired from both the 45 and the 50 Mark 7s. But they're very much similar.
Excellent. So another real quick question some of us might like to know is, what's the range that Massachusetts had with a 16-inch 45? What type of shells and what kind of range did she?
Massachusetts carried 2 types of projectiles through the war. Her initial loadout was armor piercing. 2,700 pounds is the super shell that didn't come out until later. Massachusetts carried the Mark 5, which was 2,240 pounds. Had a slight bursting charge of, I think, 40 pounds, which was the armor, the steel around it was detonated and it shattered. That provided your destructive power, clearing power. So when Massachusetts went into her first battle, Casablanca, against Hank Battery and Jean Bart, she carried all armor-piercing rounds. Now, another interesting point about the armor-piercing rounds is each round had inside of it a die marker, and it was color-coded per ship, so that way they know who was firing. If you were firing in a gun line, you had to know how to range what shells off. So a die packet was inside there, and that would Massachusetts' color in the fleet was green. Okay, so the armor piercing was the primary projectile used in this ship during Casablanca, and through the Battle of Casablanca, a lot was learned, and they were in the process of developing a high capacity, which was made for shore bombardment, not for ship-to-ship as much as it would be for shore bombardment as well as light ship, because armor piercing would just penetrate small buoys.
Right, so Battleship Massachusetts, when she went to Casablanca, her main mission was really to take on Jean Bart or Richelieu if she came out.
Correct.
They didn't expect that El Hank, the fortress of El Hank, would put out such a large resistance. So she wasn't prepared for that.
She wasn't as prepared as she should have been, but the armor piercing was not as effective as they hoped it was, and that's where the high capacity would have came in. That was, instead of being the 2,240 pound projectile, it was a lighter body called the Mark 13, and it was 1,900 pounds. It also had a further range. It had 2 mile more, because now you're not moving as much weight, so your muzzle velocity increased slightly, and so did the range. So the high capacity came in 42, 43 into the fleet, and that was used for shore bombardment, which was very important in the Pacific theater later on. And the armor piercing was less and less used, but it still was effective because it had great penetration, even against concrete and bunkers. Even later on, even all the way up to Vietnam and in Desert Storm, the penetration and the damage these things were incredible. That's why they've been recommissioned so many times. Massachusetts, unfortunately, didn't have the 50, and the U.S. Navy went with their best option, which was the 50. But the 45 was almost as, if not better in some respects.
Excellent. So since you actually are a veteran gunner's mate that served on a battleship, can you tell us a little bit about how many powder bags it needs to take to fire off a round, and how long it would take to load a round, getting it from the projectile storage rooms up into the gun, loaded and out on fire?
Well, the cycle of loading these guns is very interesting. Each round is roughly 20 to 30 seconds, and it's by manpower as well as hydraulics and lifts and powder cars. Now, that increases with motivation. So when someone's shooting at you, you tend to move pretty quick, but also good training helps because you have to be safe. Accidents can happen, and they did during time of war as well. So your 16-inch projectile was fired by 6 bags, always 6 bags, either in a full charge or reduced. Now the full charge on board here was about 90 pounds. and that was nitrocellulite. It's a derivative. Black powder is used in it as an ignition pad because it has a quick flash. So your ignition pad, when you look at it, was 10 pounds of black powder. The rest is nitrocellulite. Now these bags are weighed and balanced so that it's an even batch. Now each batch is serialized. We can get into that later on, but it's designed to give you the same effect. So that way, when you're firing, you're not getting a different effect every time. You're trying to keep that consistent so that when you range one time, you don't have to worry about constantly changing. But during like battle reports for the Casablanca, you'll notice they're constantly changing range by mils. 100 mils left, 100 mils down. It changed because your factors are continually changing from the Earth's rotation is included in the firing solution is muzzle velocity, ship's movement, and target movement. So you all have to coordinate that through the ship using, like, say, the fire control computer here, as well as your sight sets here. This is just for check sight, but we also use this for ranging as well in close quarters. Your sight setter stations on the port and starboard side of the guns would do that. So your powder bags being that full charge and reduced charge. Now the reduced charge, what people don't normally see, is for reverse slope firing as well as prolonging the life of the gun barrel. Because if you're in close range doing a shore bombardment within 5 miles, you don't need that full charge extended range. So what they used on board through these gun systems was the 8-inch 55 bags. They were less than half the weight, and they allowed you to do high angle reverse drop behind mountains
So that's
or
a heavy
emplacements.
cruiser bag.
Correct. And cans were made to fit into the racks, so you had reduced charge as well as full charge. So
Amazing.
you're constantly renewing this ammunition. Like during World War II, bombardment was constant
Sure.
from one island to the next island or multi-phase in the island. So you had an ammo chain that supplied that. And if you knew you were going to be doing bombardment, you would preload your ship for that, and you'd preset your ammunition. So your ammunition would come up through these hoists in here. These are powder hoists. They all the way down to the powder flat, the lower levels. They come up in 2-stage trays, 3 bags per. They'd come up alongside the gun. Your projectiles come up from the projectile flat. Now the projectiles on this particular gun system, the Mark 6 and the Mark 7s, are stored in the stand-up position that you'd see in the powder flats. They allow for them to be stood up and stacked offset in 4 rows on the projectile flats. There are 2 projectile flats on here. So this ship could carry 404 for turret 3 and turret 1. Turret 2 had an extra deck of 123 projectiles, I believe. That was, it's a mezzanine because the way the turret is superimposed over turret 1, so you could have firing both port, starboard, and forward over turret 1 without interfering with that. So that was a secondary storage, and during the Battle of Casablanca, it was actually distributed through the other turrets. Took 14 hours because it's to get them out of the turret and in. We go later on into that on how the ammunition is distributed around here. But each gun was given 154 rounds of ammunition.
So from the powder flat and from the projectile storage space to in the gun and fired, what do you think is the time in minutes that it would take to get that round off?
Half a minute.
Half a minute? That's how
If
fast?
if once you start it, the getting preset for a shooting is a bit complicated because the projectiles are stored in the hoist, 5 shells at a time, and it's not something fast. It uses a rack and pinion system that one piston comes up and a latch comes out, holds the projectile, grabs the next one that's put in, and it moves it up, and the side, another pinion comes out. As it's pushed aside, and there's one projectile comes up, it comes down, so the other projectile can rest, and another one can be slid in, and it's just jacked up, and you have 5 projectiles. That is usually time consuming. You wouldn't do that right off the bat cold turkey. You'd have everything pre-positioned,
And ready before you get
ready to go before you go in battle. Condition 3 steaming, ready for, one turret would normally be manned at all times. You wouldn't be at general quarters all the time, but during a wartime condition, you'd have conditions of steaming. Condition 3 would be just prior to going to general quarters. You'd have one turret fully manned, ammunition at the ready to go, powder cars up top, projectiles in the hoist, guns at load position, which is 5 degrees elevation.
Excellent, excellent. So one topic that I think we should talk about before we close this particular video off, Many may or not know that USS Massachusetts is probably one of the most historic battleships still in the world today. She was in combat. She's the last battleship to see ship-to-ship fighting with another battleship. There's none other that exists above the ocean today. She also has the decoration of firing the first U.S. Navy shot of World War II in combat, and
The last.
and also the last of anybody in combat. So I'm going to ask you, 35 naval engagements this ship was involved in, from 42 to 46. Well, actually, the end of the war in 45, but she went in through 46. She went home at the end of the war. We also know that Massachusetts was the longest stationed battleship in the Pacific at the end of World War II. She was 13 months on station without reprieve by the end of the war. That means from 44 into 45, she never got a break to come back to the States. So her documents show that she was the longest stationed battleship at the end of World War II, on site in combat. So Tom, can you tell us a little bit about how the 6-inch 45 was used by Massachusetts in combat? We talked about Casablanca a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about maybe some other actions that Big Mamie saw in World War II?
She started out in the European theater in Casablanca, and after that she came back to Boston for upgrades, where she got new receiver regulators to help fire the guns. In Casablanca, she didn't have that. She had what was called follow the pointer, so that made accuracy a little bit more difficult, and that actually helped change the fire doctrine for battleships. Massachusetts led the charge. She received her receiver regulators, which helped stabilize the computers up forward, the fire control computer system, and the directors to directly control the guns. So it eliminated that lag time in human response, and it was directly to the guns. Now these guns fire both locally and remotely. Locally, you'd have a gunner's mate in there as well. They'd be able to pull a lanyard if they had to fire the gun in percussion mode. But electrical is normally the mode that you would want to be in, because lanyard is kind of a last-ditch effort, or unless you were trying to coordinate a certain broadside, or however you had a electrical failure, you could still fire the guns manually. So as she progressed, she got the receiver regulators in the Boston Navy Yard and was updated. She went to the Pacific, where she started out as in support for fast carriers at the time, and that was one of her primary modes to the rest of the war in amphibious support. She helped out from all the major campaigns, the Marshall Islands, all the way through the Gilberts. She missed Guadalcanal, but South Dakota was there, so she rolled in 43 and kind of took over for that, because South Dakota had to come back. And you went into eventually the Philippines, you went into Iwo Jima, you went into Okinawa. Massachusetts participated in the majority of these. And she came close to combating Yamato at one time during the Battle of the Philippines. The Battle of San Bernardino Straits did not happen. The Sargasso Straits happened down the south. But if Halsey would have stayed there, Massachusetts would have been in a fleet action against the Japanese main fleet. That was missed.
Right.
Taffy 3, actually.
With Halsey, and
Right.
Massachusetts was there, and she got a radio message to turn around and help Taffy 3. So
World
Massachusetts
wonders.
almost had a huge battle. She just didn't get there fast enough.
Right, and she almost had another battle with Yamato during the actual, off the Okinawa campaign. Yamato was coming on a suicide run, and Halsey wanted to engage the Yamato in her small fleet, and what the carriers did not get, she was going to take, but the carriers made a run and overpowered it greatly. There's a bit of history with that, but also another part of it was Lionfish almost had the same opportunity. That whole situation and scenario, and it's also here at this with Admiral Spruance' son in command. So we have a great collection of history on what Massachusetts participated in and the other ships around her. But the shore bombardment became the most important. That's when the Mark 13 high capacity came in, because it didn't wear the barrel as much compared to the armor piercing. And the armor piercing, as you got into, the Mark 5 was replaced by the heavy super shell, the Mark 8, which had a weight. It went from 2,240 pounds all the way up to 2,700 pounds. It was added weight in the middle for penetrating both concrete and steel. So that way you could penetrate the armor and it would detonate within inside the ship. And then you get into different fuses that were used to help with that action. It's just not a blunt cannonball.
In discussing that, Massachusetts was with the fleet during the, going back to the home islands. She was part of the fleet that was there to stay, as they were called. And Battleship Cove is a fleet that's here to stay too. We're here to memorialize these ships, preserve them. So please like, subscribe, comment to our Facebook, our YouTube channel. If you can come down and volunteer with Tom. Tom's a gunner's mate. He's always working on our gun systems. They're working on the 5-38 trainer battery right now on Big Mamie. So if you can come down and support that, if you can donate to us, we'll have links below for you to follow. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, and come on down. These ships belong to you, and we're just trying to help preserve this heritage. Big Mamie is one of the most famous ships in American naval history, and for those from Massachusetts, no other ship built in Massachusetts besides Constitution has the same has the aura that Big Mamie does. So come on down and see her at Battleship Cove. We're America's Fleet Museum, and Tom, thank you for joining us today. We hope to talk to you more pretty soon about the 6-inch and the 5-inch battery, and maybe go into 40mm or 20mm gun systems on this ship as well. So Tom, thank you.
Be there for you. Thank you much.
We'll see you next time.